The asphalt shimmered under the afternoon heat as Eric drove his pickup down the long straight road that led to Millfield. 11 years had passed since he last crossed the county line, and the town looked smaller than he remembered: grain silos with rust-streaked sides, a water tower with faded paint peeling under the sun, houses set far apart among endless fields of corn and soy. He passed the old hardware store where he bought his first fishing rod, the diner where he had washed dishes as a teenager, and finally turned onto the gravel path that led to his father's farmhouse. George was waiting on the porch, thinner than in the photographs, leaning on a cane with both hands. The reunion was quiet, the way things always were between them. Eric had left to become a police officer in the city, and he had left behind more than just the town. Now, with his career cut short by an internal affairs investigation that never truly cleared him, he was back to care for the man who had raised him alone after his mother died. That first night, he sat on the porch listening to the cicadas and wondered if he had made a mistake. The next morning, while driving into town to pick up medication, he saw it, a heavy armored truck with dark-tinted windows, its front tires sunk into the drainage ditch at the edge of County Road 14. No driver. No emergency lights. The engine ticked as it cooled, and the silence around it felt wrong. Eric pulled over, his old instincts rising from the place where he had buried them years ago. He stepped out, the heat hitting his face, and walked toward the vehicle with the careful pace of a man who had learned to expect danger where others saw coincidence. He approached the truck slowly, scanning the surrounding fields for any sign of movement. The corn stood tall on both sides, rustling in a breeze that carried no sound of traffic or machinery. No footprints led away from the vehicle except a faint trail that disappeared into the tall grass, as if someone had stumbled toward the tree line and then simply vanished. The driver's side door hung open, the cabin empty except for a plastic cup and a crumpled map. Eric called out, but only the wind answered. He climbed into the cabin and found the cargo area accessible through a small pass-through. The rear of the truck was lined with plastic containers, but they were not filled with cash or valuables. Instead, he found stacked cardboard boxes, each labeled with dates and reference numbers that meant nothing to him. In the corner, a metal case had been forced open, its lock dangling broken. Inside were folders, dozens of them, containing photographs, bank statements, and handwritten ledgers. At the bottom of the case, a pen drive was wedged into a crack in the flooring, nearly invisible. He pulled it out and slipped it into his pocket, his heart beating faster than it should. The sheriff's office in Millfield was a single-storied building with 2 cells and a dispatch desk. Sheriff Boyd, a heavy-set man with a gray mustache who had taught Eric to fish when he was a boy, listened with a bored expression. He offered a dismissive theory about a simple breakdown and said he would have the truck towed, advising Eric to focus on his father. Eric wanted to press, but something in Boyd's eyes made him stop. He thanked the sheriff and left, but the unease settled into his chest like a stone. Eric did not believe the explanation, but he drove back to the farmhouse anyway. That evening, after his father had gone to sleep, he plugged the pen drive into his laptop. Most of the files were encrypted with layers of security he could not bypass, but one folder contained photographs that needed no decoding. They showed men in suits meeting in what looked like a warehouse, stacks of currency arranged on metal shelving, and aerial shots of Millfield itself. One image was taken from the grain elevator, looking down at the main street during what appeared to be a harvest festival years ago. Several faces had been circled in red ink. Among them was Sheriff Boyd, standing beside a man Eric did not recognize, both of them smiling as if posing for a yearbook. A second photograph showed Boyd's truck parked behind the feed supply store at 3 in the morning, the timestamp visible in the corner. Eric closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the house settle. The next day, he drove back to the site of the abandoned truck, but it was gone. The county tow truck had left deep ruts in the mud, and fragments of broken glass glittered in the dirt. He went to the sheriff's office to ask where the vehicle had been taken. Boyd was not there. The dispatcher, a young woman named Carly, informed him that the truck had been impounded and, by the sheriff's order, declared a hazard and crushed that morning at the salvage yard. Eric felt the blood drain from his face. He left without saying another word and drove straight to the salvage yard, where he found only a compressed block of twisted metal that had once been the armored truck. He knew then that whatever the truck had carried, someone in Millfield wanted it erased. He began to walk the town with fresh eyes, noticing things he had ignored as a child. The feed supply store had new owners who never seemed to sell actual feed. Trucks arrived at odd hours, their cargo hidden under tarps. The diner changed waitstaff every few months, and the owner, a woman named Delia, never looked anyone in the eye when discussing business. The largest farm in the county, owned by a man named Hollis, operated with machinery that appeared pristine, as if never used for actual farming. Eric started asking quiet questions, framing them as curiosity from a returning resident. He learned that the pen drive had contained more than photographs. The files he could not open were likely financial records spanning more than a decade. He reached out to a former colleague in the state police, a woman named Vega, who had believed his side of the internal affairs case, but the call went unanswered. That night, as he drove home on the narrow road that cut through Hollis's land, a black SUV pulled up behind him, its high beams blinding his mirrors. It followed him for 3 miles, maintaining a steady distance, before turning off without signaling. His father noticed his tension when he walked through the door. From his armchair, George suggested in a low voice that some things were better left buried, his gaze fixed on the television but his words carrying a weight of warning. Eric looked at his father, seeing for the first time the wariness in his eyes, a guarded look that suggested George knew far more than he had ever let on. The next morning, Eric drove to the truck stop on the highway, 3 miles outside Millfield. He had learned that the armored truck had been spotted there the day before it was abandoned, and he hoped to find someone who remembered it. The cashier, a woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Lena, pointed him toward a man sitting alone in a booth at the back. The man wore a stained jacket and kept his hands wrapped around a coffee cup as if it were the only warm thing he had left. Eric sat across from him and introduced himself. The man's name was Ray, and he drove long-haul routes through 4 states. Ray recalled seeing the armored truck pull in around midnight, with 2 men inside who appeared nervous. He had watched them argue near the fuel pumps before they drove off in a hurry, and he had thought nothing of it until he heard the truck had been found abandoned. When Eric showed him a photograph of Hollis, Ray's face went pale. He identified Hollis as the older of the 2 men, the one who had been shouting at the driver. Eric thanked him and left, his mind racing. He now had a direct connection between Hollis, the most powerful man in the county, and the abandoned truck. But before he could figure out his next move, his phone rang. It was Carly from the sheriff's office, her voice tight as she relayed that Sheriff Boyd wanted to see him, mentioning that it concerned his father. Eric drove back to Millfield with his hands tight on the steering wheel. The sheriff's office was quiet when he arrived, Boyd standing by the window with his back to the door. When he turned, his face was unreadable. He remarked that he had heard Eric had been asking questions, and that such behavior was making people nervous. Eric said nothing. Boyd walked around the desk and sat down, gesturing for Eric to take the chair across from him. He noted that George's health was fragile and suggested it would be a shame if the older man became entangled in matters he did not understand. The threat was barely veiled. Eric felt the old anger rise, the same anger that had cost him his badge in the city. He forced himself to stay calm and simply stated he was settling back in. Boyd smiled, but there was no warmth in it. advising Eric to settle quietly or not at all. Eric left the office and drove straight to the farmhouse. George was sitting on the porch, his cane resting against the railing. Eric sat beside him, and for a long moment neither spoke. Then George revealed that two men had come to the house the previous night while Eric was out. They had threatened to burn the house down if Eric did not stop his investigation. Eric's jaw tightened. He had underestimated how far they would go. When he asked why his father had not told him, George shook his head slowly, explaining that Eric was just like his mother, unwilling to back down, and that was how she had died. The words hung in the air. Eric had always been told his mother died in a car accident when he was 6, a single vehicle crash on a rainy night. But the way George said it now, with bitterness and grief, suggested otherwise. Eric pressed for the truth about what had happened to her. George stared out at the fields and recounted that she had found something she was not supposed to find, much like Eric had. She had gone to Hollis with proof, thinking she could expose him, and 3 days later her car went off the bridge. Eric felt the ground shift beneath him. His entire life had been built on a lie. He realized his father had known the truth and had done nothing. George's hands trembled on the cane as he explained that he had a 6-year-old boy to raise, and he had to choose between going against Hollis or leaving his son an orphan. Eric stood up, his legs unsteady. He walked to the edge of the porch and looked out at the road where the black SUV had followed him. The picture was becoming clear. Hollis had been running money through Millfield for decades, using the agricultural businesses as cover. The armored truck had been transporting records, and someone had tried to hijack it. The driver had fled. And now Eric was holding the only copy of the evidence that remained. He turned back to his father and declared that he was not stopping. That night, Eric drove to the feed supply store. He parked a quarter-mile away and approached on foot, staying in the shadows. The store was dark, but a light burned in the back office. Through a gap in the curtains, he saw Hollis sitting at a desk, talking on the phone. Beside him was a man Eric recognized from the photographs, the one standing next to Boyd at the festival. This was the second man Ray had seen at the truck stop. Eric watched for 20 minutes, memorizing the layout. When he returned home, he found a tire iron wedged through the handle of his pickup's driver's side door, a clear message. He ignored it and went inside. His father was asleep in the armchair, the television still playing. Eric covered him with a blanket and sat at the kitchen table, pulling out the photographs and the partial financial records he had managed to decode. They showed payments from a shell company based overseas to a series of local accounts, including one under the name Hollis Agricultural. The amounts were staggering. Millions of dollars moved through a town where most families struggled to pay for medical care. Eric realized that the encrypted files on the pen drive likely contained the full transaction history. If he could break the encryption, he would have everything he needed. But time was running out. He found help in an unlikely place. Carly, the dispatcher, called him the next morning and asked to meet at the cemetery on the edge of town. When Eric arrived, she was standing by a grave with a tablet in her hands. She admitted she knew what he was doing and what had happened to his mother. She explained that her predecessor as dispatcher had kept copies of records for years, suspecting Boyd of corruption. Before he died, he had given Carly a key to a storage unit containing boxes of documents. She confessed she had been too scared to act on them, but Eric's appearance had made her feel it was time. Eric followed her to the storage unit, where they found files that detailed Hollis's operation in full, the money laundering, the bribes paid to Boyd and other officials, and the names of the foreign cartel members who controlled the flow. Among the papers was a handwritten note from Eric's mother, dated the week she died, outlining her plan to contact the state attorney general. Carly agreed to help Eric contact a journalist she trusted from the city. They had 3 days before the cartel sent new handlers to Millfield to clean up the mess left by the armored truck's hijacking. The journalist, a woman named Mara from a major investigative outlet, arrived the following afternoon under the guise of writing a story on rural farming. Eric met her at a motel on the highway and handed over copies of everything he had. Mara examined the documents with growing intensity and stated that the evidence was enough to bring down Hollis and Boyd, but the encrypted files from the pen drive were crucial. Without them, she explained, the money trail would stop at the shell companies. Eric told her about his failed attempts to crack the encryption. Mara made a call, and within an hour she had arranged for a contact in the city to attempt a remote decryption. Eric drove back to the farmhouse to retrieve the pen drive, but when he arrived, he found the front door open. Inside, the kitchen was in disarray, drawers pulled out, furniture overturned. His father's armchair was empty. Eric searched every room, calling out, but there was no answer. Then he saw a note on the kitchen table, written in a shaky hand, instructing him to come to the grain elevator alone. He knew it was a trap, but he also knew he had no choice. He grabbed the pen drive from its hiding place behind a loose floorboard, tucked it into his jacket, and walked out the door. The grain elevator stood on the edge of town, a rusted tower that had not been used for storage in 20 years. Eric parked his truck at the base and climbed the metal stairs, his footsteps echoing in the silence. At the top platform, he found his father tied to a chair, a strip of tape over his mouth. Beside him stood Hollis, holding a pistol, and Boyd, whose uniform seemed absurd in the fading light. Boyd expressed his frustration that Eric had not listened, claiming they now had to clean up a mess of his making. Eric kept his hands visible and demanded they let his father go, insisting the older man had nothing to do with the situation. Hollis laughed dryly and countered that George had been hiding things for years, notes from Eric's mother, old records, always waiting for the right moment to use them. George's eyes were wet, and Eric saw in them the guilt of a man who had spent 20 years carrying a secret. Eric produced the pen drive from his jacket, offering it in exchange for his father's release. Boyd stepped forward, but Hollis held up a hand, claiming they already had copies from the truck's backups. Eric shook his head and revealed that the original data had never been in the truck, it was in the files their own man had tried to steal, the master copy that the driver had taken and lost. Now, he informed them, it was in the hands of a journalist who had already published the first story. Hollis's composure cracked for the first time. Boyd lowered his pistol, uncertainty flickering across his face as he muttered that Eric must be bluffing. Eric held up his phone, which had been recording the entire conversation, and stated that the story would go live in 10 minutes, the names, the accounts, the photographs from the storage unit. It was already done. Hollis raised his gun, but at that moment the sound of sirens rose from the highway below. Mara had kept her word. Eric had arranged for her to contact the state police once she had the decrypted files. 2 cruisers were already turning onto the gravel road leading to the elevator. Boyd backed away, his hands shaking. Hollis fired a wild shot that ricocheted off the railing, and Eric lunged forward, tackling him to the metal grate. The gun skittered across the platform and fell into the darkness below. Boyd raised his hands as the first officers appeared on the stairs. George slumped in the chair, his eyes closed, the tape still across his mouth. Eric untied him and pulled him close, feeling the old man's heartbeat against his own. By the time they descended to the ground, the farmhouse was surrounded by state police vehicles, and Mara was standing near Eric's pickup, holding up her phone with the headline already posted. The investigation that followed unraveled everything. Hollis was arrested for money laundering, bribery, and conspiracy. Boyd was charged with obstruction and accessory to multiple crimes, including the death of Eric's mother, whose car had been tampered with decades earlier. The cartel members were identified through the financial records, and international agencies were alerted. Eric's name was cleared through his cooperation, and Vega, his former colleague, called to offer him his old job back. He declined. For the next 3 months, he stayed in Millfield, caring for his father, who grew stronger with each passing week. The town slowly changed. New owners took over the feed supply store, the diner hired a permanent staff, and Hollis's land was sold to a cooperative of local farmers. On a cool evening in autumn, Eric sat on the porch with George, the same porch where this had all begun. George reached over and placed a hand on his arm, saying simply that his mother would have been proud. Eric looked out at the road, now quiet under the stars, and felt something settle inside him that had been unsettled for 11 years. He had not come back to save his father, or to find justice. He had come back because he had nowhere else to go. But now, for the first time in his life, he knew exactly where he belonged. The pen drive was long gone, handed over as evidence, but its contents had done what they were meant to do. The silence that had gripped Millfield for a generation was finally broken. Eric stayed on the porch until the night grew cold, and then he helped his father inside, closed the door, and let the past rest.